Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Margaret Rooney, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on ISO 9001-2015, How to Transition Successfully. This is one of a series of webinars that we've been running over the last 2 years or so. And as you can imagine, in that period, we've learned a lot and we've had more experience of the standard and of transitioning clients to the standard. So the event today is a pulling together of themes that have been drawn to our attention by you, our clients. That and some thoughts and observations of my own, which have become clear as I complete transitions. You will receive a copy of these slides after today, and this broadcast is being recorded, so you'll also be able to listen again to it. So I've tried to summarize what I'm trying to do in some ways today. With the catchy, or perhaps not so catchy, dismissing myths and mitigating fear. So you'll see as we go through that some of the questions, they do reflect the worries that people have. So today I want to try and reassure you as you work towards your transition. So the objectives of today is to give you an overview of the questions that we're frequently asked and to try and guide you in these areas. And the broad themes that I'll be covering this afternoon, those of you that have followed these webinars before will be very aware of our old friends: risk, process, context, leadership, policy, other challenges that come in the questions that people ask, management review, and general questions around certification to the new standard that we're asked. Just to remind you, if you have a question, you can pop that into the chat box on the right hand side of your screen. Do submit your questions throughout this webinar. You don't need to save them all till the end. There will be a few minutes at the end where we can take questions and comments from you. So, what are the types of questions that people have been asking us over the last months in the area of risk? This is a question that came out, and we get one similar to it. Do we have a template of a documented risk register? And should this include external, internal, and interested parties? Well, first of all, we can't, as a certification body, promote specific templates. But if you do choose to use a template, it's certainly helpful to include your interested parties. The primary purpose of a risk register is to help your organization identify its own needs in this respect, its own risks. So we can't recommend a specific template, but it would certainly be very useful to have a risk register. Do we need to identify the risks for each process and show them in the process? Well, you do need to identify your risks in some way. You need to be aware of them. That's what the standard is now requiring of us. If your processes are documented, it is indeed useful to document the risks also. So it's always helpful to do so, but it's not a requirement. And just to remind ourselves of the process approach, the process flow, and here we have the process turtle. So we have the core process running across the middle there with our inputs and our outputs. And then we have the support processes and resources to help us with our process flow. And we can overlay on that the associated clauses of the standard. And then don't forget, at many steps in the process and in our support processes, to think about the risks. So, how do you document the risks you're looking for and the results? So there are various ways of doing this. For example, you could consider a risk register. We've already talked about that, and on that you would record your mitigating actions. You can identify, as we've just illustrated, the risk points on process flow. And indeed, don't forget that you've probably been using procedures for a long time, and your procedures are more than likely being carried out in a particular way that help you to reduce your risks. A very specific question that comes up occasionally: can exchange rate fluctuation be a potential risk in exports? And the answer, of course, is yes. That is clearly going to be a risk. But of course, price fluctuations or exchange rate fluctuations may be an opportunity as well as a risk. So a very specific example there relating to risks. And a question, an interesting question that came up: are risks identified in a process also inputs to that process, or are they control parameters? Well, I would say they're more in the nature of a control parameter. The risk will influence the controls that you need in place to reduce or to mitigate that risk. And a specific request that came in: can you give some examples of incorporating risk from a paragraph in the standard? Is there specific wording or actions that should be used? So I've got here a couple of examples relating to risk from the standard. So we have this clause 8.4.2, type and extent of control. Now, control is in red because control is a word relating to risk. And this is lifted directly from the standard, and it relates to outsourcing. The organization shall ensure that externally provided processes, etc., do not adversely affect the organization's ability to consistently deliver product and service. That vocabulary, those words, do not adversely affect, that's a statement of risk. Whatever you do, you want to prevent adverse effects. And another example, planning of changes in clause 6. When determining the need for change, the organization shall consider the purpose of the changes and their potential consequences. And that's another way of expressing risk. And those of you who have joined previous webinars may well be very familiar with this matrix. I use it a lot because it is extremely helpful. Not devised by me, I hasten to add, but by a colleague who has identified in various clauses in the standard the vocabulary of risk. So if you look down the reference to the standard clauses, and then across the top row, on the veering towards the right, you have the vocabulary of risk. Risk itself, complex, impact, effect, likelihood, consequence. Those are all terms relating to risk. And this is really by way of saying that the standard has always been about risk. There's no particular change here. So just because we're not necessarily using the term risk doesn't mean we're not talking about or addressing risk. This was an interesting one. Any tips on how you engage senior management in a more risk-based approach? So this is where I've suggested perhaps approach the requirements from a risk perspective using the vocabulary of risk, but not necessarily the term risk itself. And you may well get a positive response to that. Management review and internal audit process might be a good place to start. Okay, now that was quite a bit on risk because, not surprisingly, we do get a lot of questions around risk. The other significant area where we get questions, of course, is around processes. So the 2015 standard refers to inputs and outputs, and we're asked, could you explain what are the expectations related to that and what are the added requirements? Well, the truth is there aren't really any added requirements. Processes were a requirement in the 2008 standard. So the need to determine inputs and outputs and the importance of processes are enhanced, I would suggest, and made more explicit in the 2015 standard. So an input could be a raw material or an instruction, and an output could be an interim or a final product. Would we suggest that all processes are process mapped as a visual document, as well as having procedures that support the processes? It's not a requirement to document your processes or to process map them, but it's certainly a very helpful thing to do. And just to remind ourselves, certainly those of you who may have listened to these before, there are different categories of processes, and these have been covered in previous webinars that we've done. We have our 3 families of processes, what we call the MOPs, management-oriented business processes, and our context and interested parties would be important in our thinking about these processes. We have what we call our COPs, our customer-oriented processes, or the core processes. And of course, interested parties are going to be important in our consideration of these also. And then we have our SOPs, support-oriented processes, which will be influenced by context. So we're beginning to see now some overlap in the various themes that the 2015 standard has brought us. So our management processes, our MOPs, we need to look here at the effectiveness and improvement of leadership activities and management processes, and this is to ensure alignment with strategy and objectives. So what sort of processes are we looking at here? Well, these are typically management processes, planning, data analysis, improvements, customer feedback, internal audits, management review, looking at the overall effectiveness of the management system. Then we have our core processes. These are the processes which directly address the customer's requirements. So the focus is on meeting those customer requirements and ensuring our customer satisfaction. And they might typically be the direct customer-facing activities like sales, contract review, design, manufacturing, and so forth. So these processes directly impact the customer. And our support processes, relating really to the resources that we need to ensure an effective system. And typically our support processes would be the processes around things like our document control, our training, our purchasing, calibration, maintenance, IT provision. Things that are very important for the effective running of our management system, but wouldn't be directly impacting on the customer. So moving now to context and questions that we're typically asked about that as well. And just to remind you, if you have any questions or comments, don't forget to type them in as we go along. So context and interested parties. What are people typically wanting to know a little bit more about in these areas? Fairly typical question. To what depth must we go to identify our interested parties? Well, do an initial brainstorm and go for the low-hanging fruit. There will be some interested parties that are immediately obvious, and you can discuss that with your colleagues and brainstorm those. You might call those the low-hanging fruit. It is an iterative process. Now, you don't have to document your interested parties. There isn't a requirement in the standard to do that, but it certainly makes it easier to audit, and you will build it up and modify it over time. And when I say it makes it easier to audit, it's not to make it easier for us, the certification body, to audit, but very much to make it easier for you in your internal audits. Don't forget that the more that's perhaps written down as internal auditors, it's going to make your job perhaps slightly easier. So think initially about your obvious interested parties, the low-hanging fruit. They'll be your customers, regulators, employees, but there may also be interested parties like investors, shareholders, bankers, if they are relevant in the context of your organization. So everything comes back to your context and what it is your system really needs. So, and also you need to think about how these interested parties could or should influence your management system, and have you taken sufficient account of their needs and expectations. So when you're doing your brainstorm and considering your interested parties, you need also to be addressing those issues. So having identified your interested parties, what are the risks of failing to act on their expectations? So brings us nicely back to the subject of risk. Everything interlinks in the standard. How do we know if we have identified all our interested parties? Well, the simple answer is you don't. You can but try, you can do your best, but you should be continually reviewing your interested parties and adjusting your management system accordingly. So your system is going to be very fluid, very flexible, and you will never know if you've got a complete list of your interested parties. But the important thing is to be thinking about it and constantly reviewing it and responding to any changes that may be needed. This is a question that we received. Context is perhaps open to interpretation, and how far this is taken will vary from company to company. Now, this is not me speaking, this is one of our clients commenting to us. How, as a management system advisor and internal auditor, do I ensure my interpretation is correct? And moreover, identify if an organisation is lacking. This is an interesting challenge. First of all, I'd say, and I've said this before, it's not for auditors to say you've got it wrong. But you can, as an auditor, as an internal auditor, as an external auditor, you can offer some guidance on things that you think could or should also be considered. So again, when we're thinking about context, probably your work is never going to be complete. You've always got to be reviewing it and perhaps revising your approach and your thoughts on the matter. And risk-based thinking may help here. Have we considered everything that we need to consider to ensure our management system is relevant to our context? What are the risks of, things that we might be ignoring or overlooking? Could we give some examples of internal issues? No significance to these at all. These are fairly generic, but when you're thinking about your context, and we have this internal and external issues, internal issue might be resources. Do we need to invest more? What the technology is coming over the horizon that we may need to be thinking about. If we're a very large organisation, are all department heads and leaders engaged in the system? Do they understand their risks and how the system should address these? This could be an internal issue that you will need to think about in your context. What I would say when it comes to context and internal issues and interested parties, try not to overthink it. That might sound a little strange, but actually a lot of these things are more obvious than you realize. What does your system need to ensure you deliver correct product and services? And that's why I say your work is never fully done, but don't angst too much about, have I thought of everything in my context? Have I thought of all my interested parties? The main thing is, have you thought of the main ones? And when you identify a gap, you can fill it. Now, this is just a very simple diagram, which I thought might be helpful. If we look at the three circles, the top one there, looking at context and interested parties and issues. And then we have our green circle, which would be our processes, and our yellow circle, the risk. There is overlap. So our processes and what they need will be influenced by our context and by our interested parties and the issues that we have. We need within our processes to also consider risk. So there is an overlap there. Looking at our context, and when you go through the exercise of looking at your context and your interested parties, think about what are the risks associated with those. What are the risks of not addressing fully their needs, for example? So it's become clearer to me over the last few months that these things are very much intertwined, interdependent. And that's why you'll hear me when we look at processes, when we look at context, the term risk will frequently come up, because risk pervades everything and we need to think about risk everywhere. And then we move on to leadership and the questions that tend to crop up around this. An interesting one: could we give examples of leadership and how to measure it? This is in the clause 5 of the 2015 standard. How do you measure leadership, or how do you judge it within your audit? Well, there are various ways we can approach this. How visible is the leadership within the organization? How inclusive? Now, if you're doing an audit, you will get a feel for this as you talk to people. Are people receiving good and clear communications? Because that would suggest effective leadership. Are employees, for example, aware of the vision, mission, the strategy, the policy? That would suggest good communications, which would suggest good leadership. Are they aware of the leadership? Have they, as it's under visibility, have they met them? How involved are they? And how involved are the employees? And it's increasingly common, I find, for example, that personal objectives are related to business strategy and objectives. So you have this trickling down from the strategy and the high-level objectives down to those same objectives being reflected in personal objectives. Now, that's good leadership, I would suggest, because the leaders are making clear what their expectations are and making it clear to the employees that they have a role in delivering those. So those are some examples of what we might typically come across by way of identifying leadership. This is a very interesting question. I do like this question, and it certainly gave me pause for thought. Would you expect leadership to be covered by internal audit? Yes, of course. Might there be hierarchy problems, given that internal auditors may not before now have spoken to anyone at chief executive or director level? I don't know if any of you, I'd be interested to know if any of you listening have encountered this or have had to think about this in some way. One good suggestion I've come across is to actually engage the leadership in the audit process so they can interview their peers. And this might help get over any cultural difficulties of reporting to a more senior person. So that's one suggestion I've certainly heard. A good audit skill is to enable leaders to see their own weaknesses. So where there are process problems or customer complaints, has a root cause analysis been done? Now, root cause could take you to leadership without you being too explicit about it. So perhaps ask the leadership team or one of the relevant managers to do a root cause analysis or offer to support them through this. And that can, in a diplomatic way, perhaps highlight any weaknesses in leadership without having to approach it too directly. Now, I'd be happy to discuss this with anybody offline because this is an interesting area of audit and internal audit. And again, depending on your context, and you're all operating in different contexts, that may be an appropriate way to go about things. It might not. You will be the best judges of that. Right, the quality policy, your questions that come that typically are asked in that area. So we're asked, what are the significant changes in the quality policy requirements? Well, as with so much, do read the requirements carefully within the standard and make sure your policy has addressed these fully and explicitly. So additions that the 2015 standard has brought. The policy must now be appropriate to the context and support the strategic direction. That's really quite explicitly stated in the standard. It must satisfy applicable requirements as opposed to comply with applicable requirements. And that's an interesting shift. Comply is the term used in the 2008 standard. Satisfy is the term used in the 2015 standard. I think that's more customer focused. It's about satisfying our customers rather than complying with a requirement. We probably need to do both, of course, but I think it's an interesting change in terminology that we have there. And it must be available to the relevant interested parties as appropriate. And again, this concept of the interested party is a new feature in the 2015 standard. Now, the 2015, I would suggest the 2015 standard, with its emphasis now on strategy, context and interested parties, I'd suggest it's an excellent opportunity to really customize your policy to reflect your organization rather than relying on a generic set of statements to satisfy standard requirements. And I'll try and illustrate this point. Here is what I would call a very generic example of a policy statement or part of a policy statement. I am not in any way here attempting to reproduce a full quality policy, but to make the point that a lot of policies can be rather generic and they are fulfilling the standard requirements, but they don't say a great deal. So we have here I have to say, fairly typical example that we would often see. We are committed to providing best service and to exceeding our customer requirements. We are committed to continual improvement of our system and to meeting our objectives. That's fine. We shall achieve this by effective implementation of a quality system which meets the 9001. That's all fine and good. Doesn't tell us anything about the organization. Doesn't give us any insight to their product or service. It doesn't really tell us anything other than they meet the standard requirements, they have a policy, they're committed to good service and to improvement. And I would suggest this is a good opportunity when you're reviewing your policy for transition, take a close look and see, can you make your policy more specific to yourselves? Because it has to support your strategy. So a more specific example, and again, I'm not attempting to reproduce a full policy, but for example, it's the strategy of ABC Training to be a training provider of choice in the engineering sector. To this end, we work closely with clients to ensure the training we develop and deliver meets or exceeds their expectations. We strive to continually improve and to meet our objectives in the areas of importance to our clients. What are those areas of importance? Well, we want to deliver relevant training in a timely manner. We want to offer professional delivery and professional presentation materials. And we want to offer effective follow-up support in the workplace. I would suggest, I'm not saying this is a perfect policy, but what I would say, this is a policy that gives you a very clear insight to, or a relatively clear insight to the context of this organization, what it is they're offering, what it is their clients expect, and what it is they wish to improve. And then as an auditor, you can go in and drill a little deeper into those three areas and say, okay, these are areas of importance to your clients. You're telling me you've got some objectives in these. Let's drill down and see what those objectives are. So that would be, you know, a recommendation from me for today is perhaps it's a good opportunity to have another look at your policy. Okay, other challenges you as our clients and webinar listeners have raised. What is the biggest challenge in the transition from 2008 to 2015? That's a big question. Not sure there is just one, is my initial reaction. I would say the challenges that people have been facing and coping with extremely well would be the process approach. Process flow charting is not widely used or hasn't been before now, and processes are not always documented, and there is no requirement for them to be so, but certainly the process approach has been a challenge for some organisation. Our old friend risk tends to be well understood, but has not been explicitly thought through in process, procedure and management system terms. I think people do have a good grasp of risk, they just haven't thought of it in the context of their management system. I'd suggest this will come with time and experience of the 2015 standard. And I would suggest that the vocabulary of risk matrix that I showed early on in this presentation could help in this respect. And a question that often comes up, does the alignment of quality, environment and health and safety through Annex SL, remember Annex SL, we don't seem to talk about it so much now, does it make it easier to implement an integrated management system? And I think it does. That's really the whole point. Annex SL is helpful in structuring a management system, and I think is very helpful in integrating all elements that you need to include in that management system. And the audits, as a consequence, should be easier and more straightforward. You will be the judges of that, those internal auditors that are listening to this. People do get concerned about objectivity, and a question that comes in various forms is, if the audit approach is moving towards discussion rather than assessment of procedures, will the results be more subjective? Well, no, they won't, because as auditors, we're still dealing with facts, and we still look at processes, whether those processes are documented or not. So things don't have to be documented to be factual, and we can work on the basis of facts that are not necessarily documented. So evidence is still required to show that processes are working. And the spoken word as evidence also, don't forget. One technique would be ask several people the same question in an audit and see if there is consistency of approach and understanding. And that would be factual evidence, and it doesn't necessarily have to be documented. Now, the standard now talks in terms of documented information. And that requirement for documented information, I think, falls into two categories. There is the documented information that is required because the standard is really quite explicit that you do need that. And I went through the standard, and there's a surprising number of clauses where there is a requirement to have documented information. Please don't try to study this now, because you will have an opportunity when you receive a copy of this presentation to look in more detail at that. And then we have those areas where you decide whether you need the documented information, where it's appropriate or determined as necessary. That's using some of the terminology from the standard. And you may or may not determine that you need documented information in these other clauses on the right-hand side. There are fewer of them. So it's a bit of a myth that 2015 has reduced the documentation requirements. It hasn't really. If you look closely, it hasn't really. There's still a significant requirement for documented evidence. So it is true that the terms procedures and records are not used. The term documented procedure is not used, but the term documented information as evidence of is frequently used. And it's important to note where that does occur in the standard. So the emphasis now is not so much on documenting your procedures, but ensuring that necessary records are kept and are available in a documented form. Management review, not too many questions, I think, tend to come up around this. Do all the elements of management review have to be covered in one meeting, or can they be incorporated across a number of meetings? And the answer is yes, they can be covered in separate meetings. And really, the important point is we tend to think of management review as a meeting, and often as an annual meeting, but it doesn't have to be. The truth is that most organisations find that a convenient way and a manageable way to do it. The requirement is actually to have a management review process, which may be a meeting or a series of meetings, but could take the form of other events, discussions, or documentation. The standard requires us to retain documented information as evidence of the results of management reviews. So that could be a report of some sort or a set of minutes, whichever form of evidence you feel is appropriate for yourselves. So as I say, not too many questions around management review. What I would advise is do read clause 9.3, management review, carefully, and make sure there are quite a few requirements in there and several new requirements, and do make sure that you cover those in your management review, whatever process you choose to adopt. And so we finish off now with just a few general queries that come up about the certification process. An interesting one: will auditors be looking for more robust systems than before since there are fewer requirements? Well, this is a myth. I hope that I've been able to convince you during this presentation that there aren't fewer requirements. If anything, there are probably more requirements. So the only requirements that have reduced are the requirements for documented procedures. There are still very specific requirements for documented evidence, as we've just spoken about. Any management system, whether highly documented or not, needs to be robust to be effective. So yes, we're still looking at robust systems, we're still looking at robust audit of those systems. So it's by no means a soft touch, the 2015 standard. Do you have to renumber your QMS to match the standard, or can the existing QMS, or can you keep your existing QMS and expand the sections to cover the new criteria? Now, I think this is just, some people seem to think that the way their system is structured or documented needs to reflect the standard. It doesn't. You do not have to renumber the elements of your quality system. There is no requirement, and there never was a requirement, to number your documentation as per the standard. As we all know, many organizations find it helpful to have a quality manual structured around the standard. And that's great, and they find it helpful, but it's not a requirement. And you don't need to have a document or a quality manual numbered around the standard, because in fact you don't need to have a quality manual now according to the 2015 standard. You may well find it necessary and useful to expand your documentation to address the additional 2015 requirements. You've got a documented system at the moment that's serving you very well. It may be numbered around the 2008 standard. That's absolutely fine. You don't have to change that if you don't want to, but just make sure, whatever you do, just make sure that when the day comes, your system is fully operating to the 2015 requirements. You judge what you need and what works best in your context. That's our old friend, context again. What happens if you do not meet the requirements of 2015 on the audit day, at the time of your transition? Will the assessors assist by advising where improvements need to be made in order to comply? We get this question in various forms. Your assessor, of course, will advise you where there are gaps in your system, as in any audit. Where there's a gap, the assessor will discuss it with you. Very happy to do that. As always, an assessor cannot tell you precisely what to do. It's your system. But the assessor will be more than happy to discuss where the gaps are. I really like this question. What does it take to fail a transition reassessment? To have done nothing, made no changes to your policy and system, and to not have thought about or articulated risk-based thinking and the process approach. If you do none of those things, if you make no changes whatsoever, of course, you're going to fail the 2015 transition. And if you fail to carry out management review and internal audit against the 2015 requirements, again, you will have failed your transition reassessment. And that's why I said a moment or two ago, do look very carefully at the new management review requirements. As far as your internal audit goes, don't forget that as part of your transition, we ask you to complete a gap analysis document, and that fulfills the requirement of an internal audit against the changes to the standard. So in summary, this presentation has attempted to capture your questions and concerns in your preparations for transition to the 2015 standard. Consider at all times what is appropriate for you in your given context and the risks you need to mitigate. You judge what you need and what works best for you. You're probably getting tired of hearing me saying that, but it really is important. It's your system, and that system should be supporting the business rather than sitting alongside it. And that's the big change that the 2015 standard is bringing in, that it's your system to support the business. And I would suggest the transition is a very good opportunity to review your system and to ensure it really does support the business strategy. So I leave you with those summary thoughts. And again, do let us know if you have a question. And we're into the question and answer part of this webinar now. And I have a question here. If you are just starting out with ISO standards, where would you recommend you start? My goodness, I'm not sure who's asked that question. I think you need to get yourself some professional help is where I would start. read the standards carefully, seek some professional help, look into what training is available. That would be my recommendation. That's a very big question. I have a question here. If we feel we are already complying with 2015 but not qualified for 2015 previously, will that count as no change and therefore a fail? No. If you're complying with 2015 and you can demonstrate you're complying with 2015, of course you're not going to fail if you comply with the requirements. When I talked about failure before, that would be assuming that the organisation did not fully meet the 2015 requirements. And I would say on that point, the organisations that transitioned relatively early on, the first few organisations we would have had transitioned, by and large, were already fulfilling the 2015 criteria, even before the 2015 standard was issued. All those things, the process approach, the risk-based approach, the effective implementation of the system in supporting the strategy, they were already in place, and that meant that they could transition quite quickly. I have a query here. Can I purchase a copy of the 2015 standard? You can. Unfortunately, you can't purchase it from ourselves, but I would recommend you go on the ISO standards website. You can purchase the organisation directly from the ISO standards people themselves. If you're having difficulty do that, drop me an email and I can send you a link. If we decide to stick to procedures, which in some cases include flowchart processes, would this cause any concern during external audit? I can't see that there's a problem with this. You've got your procedures, you've got your flowcharts. If it works for you and you can explain how it all works to your auditor, I don't see any problems with that at all. In fact, it sounds like you've made a really good start there. We disclaimed clause 7.3, that's a design clause in the old standard. Can we do the same with the new standard? I believe you can. If you don't do design, if the process of design is not a client requirement, if it's not something that you directly involve your clients in, I would say that you could disclaim that, but discuss it with your assessor. We are already trained as auditors. Is this sufficient? Well, perhaps not if you haven't done some transition training for 2015. And all training organisations that offer internal auditor training to the ISO standards, the 9001 and 14001 standards, for example, they're all offering some additional training to help you with the 2015 requirements. So I would strongly recommend that you look into that. It's not heavy training. If you're an internal auditor, I think you can do it in something like half a day. So it's not a huge commitment there, but I strongly recommend that you do get some additional support to ensure that you are doing a complete audit against the 2015 requirement. How can we get a copy of this webinar? You will receive a copy of the slides by email after today, and you can also listen again to the webinar through our website. How much detail do you expect to be given on the gap analysis tool, and must all sections be filled in? Yes, and certainly section 1 it's in 2 sections. Certainly you must fill in section 1. As much detail as you can muster. Now, if you've got a very detailed document, for example, reference the document, and then the auditor during the audit can say, you've referenced this document in the gap analysis, I need to see it. Really as much information as you can give. You know, yes, no answers are not going to be sufficient. So think of yourself, that, you know, think to yourself, what would I be looking for if I was auditing this gap analysis? And hopefully that would give you some guidance. You know, what if you were auditing, how much information would you feel you needed to put in there? Again, if you still feel you need a little bit more help with that, do feel free to get in touch with us directly. How can I access earlier webinars, presentations? I would suggest if you go on our website, I believe that there are links to all our previous webinars. Again, if you can't find them, do drop us an email and we'll point you in the right direction. I'm asked here, can I recommend literature on the audit process? Not off the top of my head. If you follow things like the publications of the Institute of Quality Assurance, for example, or training courses, would provide you with useful materials on audit. Again, do get in touch with us if you feel you need a bit more support in that respect. I think those are all the questions that we've received, and that brings us up nicely up to, it's just a couple of minutes to 5 o'clock. So you have been with us the best part of an hour. Can I just say thank you very much indeed for listening to this webinar. We appreciate the fact that you do take time out to listen to what we have to say, and we very much appreciate your questions and comments. We learn from those too, and they help us to develop and improve our future webinars and training. So thank you very much for taking time out from your busy days, and it's just for me to say thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your questions, and we look forward to you tuning in to future webinars. Thank you very much, and goodbye.